But I do want to turn to Preston Pugh, who is at the end. Preston is a trial and appellate lawyer, formerly a federal prosecutor, as I mentioned before, at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago, and an integrity monitor. He devotes most of his time to representing clients in highly regulated industries, and as we've seen already in this discussion, the question of whether international sport is highly regulated is itself probably one of the issues that has contributed to some of these problems. In 2010, just to highlight some of Preston's experience, he was appointed by the Federal District Court in Chicago as a monitor to oversee a 5-year consent decree that resulted in a settlement of a $20 million case filed by the EEOC against a trucking company. And in 2012, he was appointed as an independent private sector inspector general by the Waterfront Commission of New York Harbor, the very first of its kind, where he was responsible for the oversight of a stevedore that had previously been associated with organized crime. And it's that IPSIG, this independent private sector inspector general issue, which is one that, among other things, Preston will explore. Preston, to you.
Thank you, Jeff. All right. So you sat for about an hour listening to, frankly, what you might call a tough road, right? A tough story. International sports are a difficult place because of the corruption that exists, and frankly, when you read into the area, when you hear the speeches and so on, what you realize is that the skepticism about the potential for change in international sports is, frankly, what we've seen in other areas, right? Pharma, for example, or medical devices, or military defense. And frankly, that skepticism is all well-founded, and perhaps in sports for reasons that are slightly different in those other areas. As I begin, Mike gave a disclaimer about not speaking for any of his clients. I don't speak for any of mine either, but I want to give a more important disclaimer. All of our panelists here, except for myself, are true experts in international sports. And it's frankly the dialogue between them that I think this audience will get quite a bit from. So my remarks will be short. My expertise in sports really comes from watching two beautiful little girls play for the last 10 years, soccer, cross country, softball, and a lot of other things. So what I can speak to is compliance, because I've been in the compliance field for some time. And in some ways you can look at being an AUSA, as I was in Chicago, as a form of compliance. But more importantly, I've been inside doing investigations for defense companies. I've been inside for healthcare companies and medical equipment manufacturers doing investigations. And I've been a monitor a couple of times. The fact is, every field that has these types of problems, if you look closely, there really is reason for pessimism, right? So think about what defense looked like 30 years ago, and the dollars that were passing back and forth. Think about what pharma looked like 20 years ago. Think about what banking looked like maybe even before Dodd-Frank and some of the other regulations. And you look at those and you say, how are we ever going to get at the root of the problem? How are we ever going to correct these things? You know, they're too interwoven. And of course, sports, soccer being one that we're talking about, or football that we're talking about today, is one of those things. I would pose to you this, that just as we found a way to alleviate some of the problems in these other complex areas, if there's a will, and if you have the right devices and players in international sports who will speak up, that we'll find a way there to correct some of these problems as well. And one of the reasons, frankly, is I think about it from the United States model. For example, does FIFA ever want to become the US version of the Worldwide Wrestling, or WWF, right? Or boxing, or other sports that have been cheapened? Because all of this money comes from people, you know, essentially from them watching. as was shown to you before, marketing and TV rights are where the money is. Well, where does the TV rights come from, right? It eventually comes down to who's watching our sport and who's engaged in our sport, who's rooting for a team, who's going to the matches and things of that sort, right? So if in the public's view these sports are cheapened by corruption, then the money that fuels them will become a problem. The second thing is we know that change is possible. We talked about some of the regulated fields, healthcare and so on, and we also talked about the fact that in some of these other countries you were able to get a tax write-off, right, for making certain payments. But we know change is possible because there's another place where you could get a tax write-off for making payments too. It's here. It's in the U.S. Before the FCPA, companies got write-offs. Before 1972, companies got write-offs of some way, shape, or form. So we know change is possible, okay? So the principles that were used in some of these other fields, healthcare, defense, and so on, can be used in sports. You need transparency, as Mike talked about. You certainly need accountability, as Dave talked about as well. You need to have insiders with the will who want to improve their sports. And I think that Gareth talked about that as well. And you need an outsider who is attuned to these issues and can perhaps help these organizations in the right way overcome these challenges. And one type of outsider is what we call an IPSIG, or Independent Private Sector Inspector General. This position has been used in New York quite a bit, in Boston, in Miami, in Chicago, and overseas. And the reason why this position is important is because of the problem that Dave pointed to earlier, right? So on one hand, you have an external accountability issue. And on the other hand, you have an autonomy issue in international sports. I won't go over it too much because Dave already did, other than to say that in a typical corporation, you have external accountability and the public wants to see it, right? They want to see Johnson & Johnson be accountable to the U.S. government and so on. But in sports, you have this autonomy issue because, as Dave said, a number of countries have used sport as something more than just sport. There's a fear that the Olympics and other types of organizations will be used for geopolitical purposes instead of for true sport. And so sometimes those things conflict, right? It's this that is created what Gareth talked about, which is the kind of a right playing field for organizations that are not patrolling themselves and nobody else from the outside really wants to. But yet there's this need for them to be patrolled, and an IPSIG can help. So what is an IPSIG? An IPSIG is an independent private sector firm with legal accounting, investigative research, and so on, expertise. And essentially the goal is for that person or group or firm to come in and work with the organization to achieve the change that the organization has either been told it needs to make or itself wants to make internally. It comes, of course, from the Inspector General statute. And you can see in your slides a number of the points, but one of the key things is, and he asked, where can an IPSIG be used best? I would pose, and others may disagree, but I would pose that it can be used best when the organization wants to change, is amenable to reform. It can also be used, of course, when it's hostile to change, but then it needs to kind of be imposed externally. And when we think about sports, I think that there are some organizations that want change. So in Gareth's global corruption report, there's a description about Kenyan soccer and the change that it wanted to create. But then there's some other organizations in Asia, for example, that need change. So there are some that fit in the first category, and there are some that fit in the second one. Now, we're certainly not the first to pose that an IPSIG or that some sort of monitoring function could be used to improve international sports. In fact, there are monitors that are being used in international sports now. They're, for example, looking at analytics that pertain to betting and the outcome of certain games. And there are some internal monitors that are being used. But I want to be clear, a monitor is different from an IPSIG for a few reasons. One of them is that an IPSIG is bound by certain principles. And in other cases, if you appoint a monitor, you're not exactly sure, the public is not exactly sure what principles they are bound to. I want to focus on the last point here. So there's more of a focus by an IPSIG working with the organization, and it's not the LifeLock commercial. Now, how many of us have seen the LifeLock commercial where there's a bank robbery and there's a guy in the uniform and he's simply, when the robbery happens, he simply stands up and says, hey, there's a robbery, right, as opposed to helping them prevent the robbery, right, or fix the problem. An IPSIG is not that guy in the uniform. An IPSIG is the one who actually helps the organization change, works with them, is not, the focus is not a gotcha, right? And I think that some of these sports organizations that have been discussed might be open to the idea of someone from the outside really helping them. As I think about it, there's two ways that you could use an IPSIG. So on one hand, you heard a lot about the need for organizational change, FIFA, for example, and really just improving it top, bottom, and really looking at all of its programs and looking where the potential for corruption exists and figuring out a way to get rid of that potential for corruption or real corruption. That's one example. Another one is, if you think about it, the Olympics, where it's more event-based, where you use an IPSIG for specific reasons, looking at, for example, the contracts that are procured to build certain, think about it, facilities or swimming pools or whatever it is that's needed to be built. The IPSIG can help track costs. Can help with vendor spending, make sure that conflicts of interest don't exist. I actually think that this second group is an easier place for an outsider like an IPSIG to help, although it can certainly be used in the first example as well. These are some of the places where IPSIGs have been used, and the point on this slide is this. Each of those engagements is very different. Right? So the first one is construction. The second one is really features in a car. The third one is dealing with a global conglomerate. The fourth is dealing with a union in New York. The fifth one is dealing with a stevedore with some very unique labor issues. And the fifth one has to do with work rules in a workplace, making sure that there's not harassment and discrimination. The point is that if an IPSIG can be used in these different examples, we can find a way for it to be used also in international sports. So I will leave us with that in hopes of getting into some of the discussion that we talked about.